All right, so we'll go ahead and start with an introduction to anatomy and physiology. So, just as an overview of anatomy and physiology, anatomy is the scientific discipline that investigates the structures of the body, whereas the study of physiology will investigate the function of those structures and how they work together to support the living organism, or us in this case. So really, anatomy and physiology is two studies under one umbrella of interest, which is understanding the body and how its structures function in a system. So some anatomical topics to discuss. There are two different aspects. You can study a gross or macroscopic type of anatomy with structures that can be examined without a microscope. So looking at here, a brain, we can kind of look at the lobes and guess functionality based on those lobes, but we don't need a microscope in order to look at those. Or we can also use microscopic anatomy to investigate neurons, so structures that need a microscope. So there's cytology, which is like the study of cells, or histology, which is the study of tissues. And we'll get more into those two different topics later in the semester as well. Physiological topics include aspects of homeostasis, which will be a key term throughout all of this class, so keep that one in your mind. It's the state of steady internal conditions that are maintained by living organisms. This is a dynamic process, and we'll go a little bit more into depth with that later. There are also, again, macroscopic or microscopic observations within physiology. So one example could be neurophysiology, which is the study of the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, and we can look at how these function together to perform complex tasks like movement, thinking, and visual processing, among other things. We can examine them at the organ level, such as what parts of the brain do what, a more macroscopic approach. We can also examine them at the molecular level, that we would need a microscope or other different tools to look at, such as looking at how an electrochemical signal travels along neurons or nerve fibers. And there are other examples of physiology, such as cell physiology, which is the study of cells and how they function, pathology, which is the study of disease and disease states, and cardiology, the study of hearts and cardiomyocytes, different heart cells. So when we're looking at life, there are certain characteristics that are required to maintain life. If we look at the human cell, for example, there is a plasma membrane that keeps stuff on the inside separate from stuff on the outside. Blood vessels keep blood inside a closed circulatory system. In the chest and abdomen, a variety of internal membranes keep major organs such as lungs, heart, kidneys separate from each other. The skin is an example of a boundary as well. This boundary maintains protection for the organism, or us, from harmful pathogens or toxins. Movement. It occurs throughout the body in the form of substances such as blood or urine, as well as in joints and muscles, contracting or extending with the help of bones. Responsiveness. It's carried out by the endocrine and nervous system, which we'll touch on much more in depth later in the semester, but these help maintain homeostasis, which is the body's balance system again. And this helps the body cope with a changing environment. More life function or necessary life functions like digestion of food material is essential, such as starches breaking down into glucose for the use of life-sustaining processes. Metabolism, it's a chemical reaction in the body. An example of this would be creating new substances based on digestive material for life-sustaining processes. A result of metabolism is the buildup of wastes, which need to be disposed of before they become toxic by building up. We have kidneys that help dispose of waste in the form of urine, intestines that dispose feces, lungs that dispose carbon dioxide. Reproduction of an entire organism when zygotes are formed, as well as reproduction of cells like skin cells that are replaced over time. We also have growth in the size and number of cells. Some cells increase in size and some increase in number, like neurons, whereas muscle cells increase in size throughout time. So these are necessary functions of life, and now we can kind of look at some survival requirements. When we're looking at survival requirements for humans in particular, we need appropriate amounts of certain substances. Too much or too little is harmful for the organism. Substances like complex carbohydrates, fats, proteins, minerals, vitamins, these are all needed for general metabolic processes and life-sustaining processes. Oxygen is needed in cellular respiration to help produce ATP for energy release. Water is the most abundant molecule in the body, and it's in an environment for chemical reactions to take place, as well as a fluid base for secretions and excretions. Maintaining a normal body temperature is crucial as well, as when temperature gets too high or too low, enzymes don't function properly and the body struggles to carry out life-sustaining processes. And we need appropriate atmospheric pressure as well, because our bodies evolved to withstand certain pressure ranges, and outside of those ranges, they can be incredibly harmful to us. So this is also obviously critical for adequate breathing and gas exchange. So before diving into the structures and functions of the human body, it's a good idea to take a view of the basic architecture, or in other words, how its smallest parts are assembled into larger structures that make up the whole organism. You can kind of think of the body in terms of fundamental levels of organization that increase in complexity. Subatomic particles help form atoms, which help form molecules, which help form organelles, which help form cells, which help form tissues, which develop into organ systems, becoming organisms, and the biosphere in general. The simplest of all of these is what I said first, is subatomic particles, such as atoms and different molecules. All matter in the known universe consists of pure substances known as elements, such as oxygen and carbon. The smallest unit of any element is the atom of that element, which consists of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Two or more atoms can combine to form molecules, such as water molecules, proteins, and sugars found in living things. And then molecules are these building blocks of all the structures in the body, including cells, which are composed of a variety of these molecules that form structures that aid in independent functioning of the cell. These structures are known as organelles. Tissues consist of a group of many similarly functioning cells that work together to perform a specific function. An organ consists of two or more tissue types. Organs perform one or more specific physiological function. And an organ system is a group of organs that work together to perform major functions in the organism at the organismal level. We'll discuss 11 different organ systems in the body, but keep in mind as we go that not all organs are limited to one organ system. In fact, most of the organs contribute to more than one organ system. As you can see, organization plays a crucial role in the functionality of a living organism. So, key term when discussing anatomy and physiology is homeostasis, like I said earlier, which is a dynamic state of equilibrium or balance in which internal conditions can vary but remain within narrow limits. This means that variables or factors can change, like blood pressure can change and heart rate can change slightly, but they're dynamic, which means that they're slightly changing within narrow limits. And when changes go outside those limits, the body looks for ways to bring the body back to homeostasis, or this state of equilibrium. So our body maintains a feedback system for when a variable is changing outside the narrow limits, so it can elicit the appropriate responses to get back to equilibrium. The feedback system starts with recognition of an altered variable by a sensor in the body, which, if outside the homeostatic limit, triggers an integrator, like the brain, to get that response back into balance. And this integration will elicit the effector to help carry out that balancing act. So let's first talk about homeostatic variables. There are many aspects of physiology that are constantly changing, such as the concentration of nutrients in oxygen, carbon dioxide, pH, concentration of water, salt, waste products, temperature of the body, and volume and pressure in various cavities. These are all factors or variables that are changing at any given moment in the body based on what the body is doing or being exposed to by its environment. So we have a way of monitoring and regulating these factors that can change. For example, we can control our blood pressure by regulating the size of blood vessels via vasoconstriction or dilation of the vessel to change the pressure of the blood that's moving through that vessel. So again, the monitoring and regulation is carried out constantly or dynamically, and this needs to be communicated to the rest of the system so as to allow adaptation or balancing back to equilibrium to occur. This communication is carried out by the nervous and endocrine systems, which utilize electrical and chemical signaling to elicit change by effectors. We'll dive deeper into the nervous and endocrine systems at different points throughout this semester, but just trying to understand the surface level of what actually communicates these signals is definitely necessary at this point. So let's go ahead and look at one type of homeostatic control called a negative feedback, which is a type of feedback that occurs when the body is out of equilibrium and it needs to respond to this out of balance variable in the opposite direction. For example, the body can go through a negative feedback cycle to bring body temperature back into the normal range when nerve cells in the skin and brain sense that the body temperature is exceeding a normal range, 37 degrees Celsius. These sensory cells will elicit the temperature regulatory center in the brain, the integrator, to stimulate sweat cells or glands in the body to release heat in the form of evaporation of sweat, which is the effector. The big thing to remember is that negative feedback is the most common feedback system, and it is stabilizing by changing the variable in the opposite direction like a teeter-totter. Next, we have positive feedback control, which is different in that it is not as common and the variable does not change in the opposite direction as a result of feedback control. What happens is the variable changes in the same direction, but is accomplishing something different than maintaining homeostasis via stabilization, like negative feedback does. For example, during childbirth, the head of the baby pushes against the cervix, which transmits electrical signals to the brain, which then stimulates the pituitary gland in the brain to secrete oxytocin, which is then carried in the blood to the uterus to stimulate contractions, pushing the baby against the cervix even more, eliciting more oxytocin release from the pituitary gland. So this cycle just continues. Another example is when the baby suckles on the mother's breast. It stimulates the milk to flow, and more suckling stimulates more milk to flow until the baby is satisfied or the milk runs out. So again, we aren't just decreasing anything, rather we're increasing it. Another example is blood clotting, which continues clotting until the vessel is sealed off and bleeding stops. Again, the response adds to the initial condition. Clotting causes more clotting until the bleeding is stopped. Positive feedback occurs anytime that we can have an increase in the response to accomplish the task. So this can happen in multiple different systems and in a variety of ways, and there's multiple examples of this described throughout your text as well. And this is going to wrap up the introduction to anatomy, and in the next video we will discuss chemistry.